So, if atheism is simply the lack of a belief in God, then I guess that theism is just the lack of a belief in a godless cosmos. Wait, that's not a pun. That's just spicy. You might say that my streak has suddenly been pun done. Just as there are many arguments for theism that have existed through the ages, so too is the case for atheism. We have record of atheists existing throughout history. And I've discussed on this channel a few incidences of atheists in history, namely the Viking Age and in the Roman Empire. But it stands to reason that when there is disagreement on the ontology of the gods, among those disagreements would likely be a complete disagreement, that there are no gods in the first place. Now, keep in mind that when I'm saying atheist here, I'm referring to the philosophical tradition, not the movement of new atheism popularized by atheists known as the Four Horsemen, which was fueled by a cultural response to 9/11. By atheist arguments here, I mean arguments that God or gods do not exist. This is distinct from the often articulated Mott and Bailey approach taken by atheists who ascribe to themselves a lack of belief. This often manifests as making claims against theism or religions, and then, if pressed, retreating to saying that they are simply unconvinced. Atheist arguments, by this understanding of arguing for the proposition that God or gods do not exist, aim to give an argument that either show that God logically cannot exist, or show that the reality that we live in is one that makes claims of deities improbable. So there's two distinct aims that might be taking place with these arguments. Often, the argument is aiming at a particular deity, and traditionally, atheism has largely existed as a counter-tradition, responding to the popular theistic arguments of the day, and as a result, many of them are tailored for monotheistic traditions, making how they affect polytheism an interesting conversation. I'll point out that a lot of atheistic arguments have to do with criticism of the texts related to religions themselves. Usually these arguments have to do with a contradiction that is expressed within the text, or a discrepancy between the text and our understanding of reality. A common example of this would be something like a contradiction between the Genesis account and the formation of the universe and our planet. Things like pointing out that the Bible's account suggests that plants predate the sun and the moon, or any myriad of objections to young Earth creationism. These kind of arguments often depend heavily on what I like to call mythic literalism, that these religious texts are to be interpreted literally and understood to exist without errancy. Generally, this is unique to a subset within the various monotheist traditions, and is a position that many Christians, for example, don't even hold. So these arguments only go so far as disproving a God as it exists under this particular set of beliefs. These kind of beliefs are not as common among modern polytheists, who tend to avoid mythic literalist interpretations of their traditions. Personally, I find that heathens who hold to mythic literalism to be few and far between. I won't go so far as to say they don't exist, as I've encountered a few of them, but they're so exceptionally rare and get significant pushback whenever they show themselves. For example, the concept of the Earth being formed out of a Jotun's skull is a little far-fetched, to say the least. However, the conception of the universe as assembled from the body of a defeated deity can lead to an interesting discussion, looking at the spirit of the text rather than the letter of its descriptions. And from the perspective of heathenry, it's hard to defend the idea that the texts are divinely inspired and wholly true from start to finish in the first place. The records that we use were not written by practitioners of the faith. There's a variety of authors, including Christians, Muslims, and Romans, but no heathens. And they have numerous areas of conflict due to the reality of diversity among historical traditions within heathenry. And this diversity in tradition is something that heathens tend to see as a strength, not a weakness. So mythic literalism not only results in claims that do not reflect reality, but it results in conflicting, absurd, or just plain vague descriptions of whatever that reality would be. So having a mythic literalist interpretation of heathenry, it just doesn't make any sense, which is likely why it's so rare. Most heathens seem to recognize that they're learning about history through historical text with varying degrees of reliability. We're peeking into the past through the windows that we have, and there isn't much opportunity to even have a mythic literalist narrative in the first place. We're used to dealing with wave after wave of unknowns when looking for specifics, or even being met with the opposite, a variety of deferring answers. As a result, atheistic arguments appealing to a mythic literalist interpretation of these various texts do not land very well with polytheists, as we are, by and large, not mythic literalists. This even bears out in a historical analysis. In Cicero's text, On the Nature of the Gods, he describes polytheists in dialogue with one another discussing the gods and how they are seen by different schools of philosophy in ancient Rome. None of them describe what could be called mythic literalism, so it seems that even those in antiquity were well aware that a mythic literalist interpretation was not the way to go. Mythic literalism interpretations are largely restricted to creationists, and not really that many others. So criticisms of religion that rely on mythic literalism interpretations apply only within the bounds of those that adhere to such interpretations. And to all others, the criticism becomes a straw man, even to those traditions that have a comparatively high population of mythic literalists. The Genesis criticism that I offered earlier might work on a creationist, but it wouldn't work very well on a Christian who isn't a creationist. And since broadly polytheists do not adhere to such interpretations, we can dismiss this kind of objection fairly easily. Next, I want to look at the appeal to simplicity, because I think it's the strongest one, and it's the one that most affects polytheism as well as monotheism, so it's absolutely worth discussing. Now, the thrust of the argument is that naturalism is a far simpler explanation of reality, as it requires less assumptions than other explanations of reality, and that we should have a preference for explanations of reality that require fewer assumptions. This leans on a concept commonly known as Occam's razor, which is that the explanation with the least number of assumptions, that is, the simpler explanation, should be preferred. Now, there's nothing actually unreasonable about this. This is one of the reasons why many modern atheist philosophers land on atheism. They justify this by saying Occam's razor gives us reason to consider naturalism to be the result of an inference to the best explanation. The responses to this usually utilize a cumulative case of all of the arguments in favor of theism, ranging from logical arguments to appeal to experience and so on. This will be used to show that even if naturalism is simpler, it doesn't necessarily need to be preferred as a result. This response could be used by either a monotheist or a polytheist, but I think that it works better from polytheists. Something that should be pointed out is that simpler doesn't necessarily mean true, which is articulated by an objection which I like to call the appeal to zebra. The term comes from Dr. Theodore Woodward's articulation of the value of Occam's razor in the 1940s and became a medical slang for obscure diagnoses. A version of the example is to imagine that you're walking down the streets of New York and you hear the sound of hoof clops behind you. Knowing nothing else about your situation, what do you assume is the case? Occam's razor would prefer the simplest explanation. So let's examine the two possible outcomes of animals with hooves that could exist in New York. One would be a horse pulling a carriage, and the other would be a zebra from the zoo. So, how do we go about this analysis? We can examine how one runs into horses and zebras in New York. Zebras are found exclusively in the zoo. Horses, however, are found pulling carriages down the street in a myriad of places around the city. So if one is walking down the street and hears hoof clops behind them, in order to be a horse, one way to explain it is that one of these carriages is behind you. In order to be a zebra, the explanation has to be that one of these zebras escaped the zoo and made its way to your particular location. The zebra requires a few more assumptions, so it's reasonable to conclude that the hoof noises behind you are actually coming from a horse. The point of the analogy is that when making diagnoses, one should prefer the horse over the zebra. Woodward would say, think horses, not zebras. The simpler and more common explanation is often the true one, rather than some rare and exotic disease that is also consistent with the symptoms, even if it may stick out in your mind a little bit more. However, an important caveat to the analogy is that while most of the time in this situation you might turn around and it's a horse, sometimes it is the zebra. This is, it's largely the premise of the TV show House, in which diagnostician Gregory House seems to be constantly dealing with medical zebras, in part because he famously prefers and gets referred particularly difficult cases. In fact, the show's fandom has ranked various episodes on the basis of what they call the zebra factor. A low zebra factor might arise from, say, a common disease in a patient who delayed the diagnosis by lying about their medical history, for example. A higher zebra factor might come from a disease that is so rare that most doctors will just never come into contact with it. So while these medical zebras are rare, They do still exist, and they should be kept in mind until they can be eliminated. The point is, the most parsimonious explanation is not always the fact of the matter, and the history of science has a number of zebras, where a more complicated reality happens to be the fact of the matter, even if it was considered unlikely before it was shown to be true. So, Occam's razor isn't a truth maker, and shouldn't be seen as one. It may be reasonable to prefer the explanation with the least number of assumptions, but sometimes reality is complex. This means that rather than appealing to simplicity, we should look at the cumulative case of all of the arguments together. And even if it is reasonable to say that naturalism has the advantage in simplicity, that advantage may be meaningless. Polytheism or monotheism may show an advantage in other arguments, perhaps such that the advantage in simplicity doesn't have much weight. This truth enables those arguing for theism to say that simplicity is not necessarily a reason to reject theism, as complexity does not bear out to being false, and simplicity does not bear out to being true. Sometimes the answer is a zebra, or rather it's sometimes just not the horse. Sometimes it's a dude with two empty halves of coconuts, banging them together, brought to New York by a swallow, having gripped it by the husk.
It could be carried by an African swallow.
Another objection to theism as argued by atheists is the famous problem of evil. Now, this comes in two forms, and one has more force than the other. And these are the logical and evidentiary problems of evil. The logical problem of evil is credited to Epicurus by Hume through the church father Lactantius, who was likely mistaken about this attribution. Epicureans sometimes get mislabeled as atheists, but they fall more into a polytheist version of deism. Now, Hume quotes Epicurus like this: Epicurus's old questions are still unanswered. Is he, God, willing to prevent evil but not able? Then he is impotent. Is he able but not willing? Then he is malevolent. Is he both able and willing? Well, then whence come evil? This statement has long had some punch, but let's take a look at the argument in a more formal form. I'll throw it up here. Now, taking a look at this argument, premises 1 through 5 are fairly agreeable to a monotheist, but a polytheist can get out of this argument immediately by simply disagreeing with premise 1. Traditional polytheism is often described as holding that the gods do not possess the omni-traits that are described in this argument, so this premise is easily denied. After that, everything is a straw man, and there's no reason to further engage. But, in fairness, Neoplatonists do exist, and they have to contend with this, as they will often hold these attributes about the gods. So, we're not out of the woods yet, but stuff like this is largely where I do hold disagreement with Neoplatonism personally. So we should talk about it. So, Christians, in my opinion, defeat the logical problem of evil fairly effectively by offering explanations of why God allows evil. These are called Theodicies. A strong example of a theodicy, which in my opinion defeats the problem of evil, would be a greater good theodicy that shows that the existence of evil allows for a greater diversity of goodness. Without evil in the world, there is no chance for the kinds of good that manifest as responses to evil. Among them are things like mercy. In a world without evil, it is impossible to be merciful. For example, farts are evil, as they bring about significant suffering. And a world without farts would be less evil than a world with farts. However, God allows farts because it allows people to show mercy by not pointing it out when someone lets it rip at the dinner table. Thus, the existence of the evil of farts is justified, even though it brings about suffering. This extends to natural evils, not farts, but disasters. The charitable goodness that results from responding to such disasters would not be possible without the existence of such evils. As a result, the problem of evil may be valid in form, but it fails to take into account this theodicy. So the result is that the argument can be fairly easily shown as a failure. Now, another theodicy might be that God wishes for souls to have experiences so that their souls may develop. Souls that have experienced evil may become more developed than those who have not. And the justification for developing souls could be any number of ideas, but we intuitively see biblical characters, and characters in stories generally, to be more compelling if they face significant challenges and overcome something, sometimes evil. Therefore, there is reason for God to allow evil to exist. And polytheists, namely Neoplatonists, but polytheists generally as well, could easily adapt these theodicies to our own purposes. The evidentiary problem of evil comes in when we look at those evils themselves. And this is where the strength of the problem of evil really shines. The question arises that if the universe we live in is the product of a perfect God, then the evil present in that universe should only be sufficient to meet the requirements of the theodicy. But there are times that we can put forward examples of unnecessary evils, such as evils that are only experienced and never overcome, and which never receive a response. There are also natural evils, which would be seen as unnecessary, diseases which cause people to die in extreme pain, especially silent pain, seem like an unnecessary evil within any theodicy, and become difficult to explain as a result. An especially compelling example would be instances of the unnecessary suffering in the case of animals, which are not undergoing the soul development according to Christian theodicies, so the presence of any suffering at all is unnecessary. Take, for example, a fawn dying alone in a forest fire. It is a natural event, witnessed by no human being, experienced by a conscious being that will not go to an afterlife according to most monotheists, and yet incredible unnecessary suffering occurs. This example does not mean that God does not exist, but it certainly undermines the theodicies designed to defend the existence of evil, so the likelihood of the God these theodicies defend goes down significantly. Now, atheists might say that this increases the likelihood of atheism, but I don't think so. Perhaps it makes atheism more likely than this particular expression of monotheism, but polytheism expresses the strength of the various theistic arguments as we discussed in my previous video, and yet does not fall prey to the problem of evil, and therefore does not need theodicies, even if they might apply. The polytheist not only can take on all of these theodicies when discussing humanity's relationships with the gods, but also undermine the argument entirely. It is reasonable for the polytheist to say that we overcome obstacles as part of our relationships with the gods. Odin and Thor specifically are known among their adherents for forging strength as part of that reciprocity. And this ties in with the existence of various evils, justifying that development because of the opportunity for honorable or good actions. Traditional polytheists also hold that the gods are not the only powerful agents, but that there are also malicious forces in the universe. Within heathenry, there are stories of Jotun, trolls, and other beings that bring great harm to the gods and to humanity. Consider the jaws of Aegir, bringing down ships in storms, putting Aegir in this space between devourer and deity. There are stories of the gods in struggle with each other. There are stories of kinds of gods engaging in destructive war against each other, such as the Aesir-Valnir War. So the problem of unnecessary suffering is easily explained by stating that the gods, while powerful, do not govern every event in the universe, and may not always be in agreement. Therefore, unnecessary suffering, while frustratingly unnecessary, takes place. This interpretation, in my opinion, also raises the stakes of your actions. One should examine what they are contributing to the world, and to which end they are tipping the scales with their actions. Religions that lean on the triomni God often put one in a place of complacency that all things will work out in the end. And in the case of many polytheist traditions, that's not necessarily true. Humanity can lose. We could, through our actions, squander our environment and destroy all living things, reducing our existence here to nothingness. And it's our responsibility to make sure that this does not happen. The gods won't simply stop it from taking place if we seem intent on bringing it about. We have responsibility. I want to talk next about divine hiddenness, which is one of the strongest objections to the triomni monotheist traditions. It's sometimes seen as a subset of the problem of evil, so I want to discuss it briefly afterwards. The argument hinges on the existence of what it calls non-resistant non-believers. So consider an example of a person who does not believe in God, but is actively searching and or puts up no resistance to a belief in or a relationship with God. The argument of divine hiddenness then pits against this the existence of an unsurpassingly great deity, who is therefore unsurpassingly loving, and says that the fact that there are non-resistant non-believers who do not ultimately find this deity, or this deity does not ultimately find them, shows that this deity does not exist. And when substantively explored, this one is a knockdown argument against typical monotheist conceptions of God. Now, I've seen a video in which Richard Swinburne, famous theologian, has responded to this argument briefly, and his defense largely rests on free will to choose a relationship with God, and that if God was so readily apparent, then it would affect our free will. But I don't think this objection lands very well. The whole point is that these people are non-resistant and in many cases actively searching. Is it then the case that in order to secure our freedom of will, some who are actively searching for an unsurpassingly loving God are simply abandoned? It doesn't seem to match up for me. I'll link the video below of Swinburne responding to various arguments for atheism, and regardless of whether or not you agree, it is really interesting. So, it would make sense to me that in order to combat divine hiddenness, God should at least be as apparent as the external world. Our freedom of will, such that we have one, doesn't seem forced to believe in the external world, as there are many who disagree about its nature and whether or not it even exists. But it's pretty readily apparent in our experiences. Now, disregarding the fact that I don't think that we choose our beliefs anyway, whatever God or the gods are, they seem less apparent than the external world. And I think this actually threatens our free will even more because we're not able to make an informed decision about our beliefs, which has a lot of consequences if you hold to some kind of belief-based salvation afterlife. Polytheism, however, gets out of this argument in much the same reasons that it escapes the problem of evil. The gods are not unsurpassingly loving. Some might be considered loving deities, and others might have a special interest in humanity, but it is not required for them to have a relationship with us, nor for us to have a relationship with them. And sometimes those who seek do not find. It seems that's the nature of some of our journeys, which is fine, really. Life can still be enriching without the gods, though this does not come with the same pitfalls as does a Christian saying the same thing, given the whole salvation thing being tied to belief, and then arguably several steps after that. With Christianity, the non-resistant non-believer searching but not finding a relationship with God has the consequence of damnation, sometimes eternal damnation. For polytheism, it does not seem that a lack of piety is actively punished in the afterlife. It seems that there are sometimes advantages in fostering a relationship with your ancestors or various deities. But there are some afterlife deities in heathenry that seem to be an exception to this, such as Sindri, who builds a hall of red gold specifically for the virtuous. Not the virtuous who believe, mind you, just the virtuous. And this would account for a potential afterlife for the non-resistant non-believer who seeks but does not find, and yet lives a life of good character. There is also the objection on the basis of the definition of God. The classical theist definition of God that is the subject of so much controversy has significant argumentation defending it, and significant argumentation attacking it. And as such, there's been an evolution over the years about what this conception actually is. Listening to someone defend the ironically complex concept of divine simplicity can feel very different than the typical description of God. Objections to and defenses of the Trinity place even further stress on this conception. So, look, after a while, people might speak up and say they just have no idea what anyone means when they say God. And because there's a lack of coherency when describing the concept, or such a wide diversity there doesn't seem to be any consistency, it's reasonable to just say that, hey, everyone needs to get on the same page first, or this whole conversation is just bonkers. And this is the non-cognitive objection, that God does not have a discernible definition and is therefore meaningless, and therefore discussing this God is equally meaningless. There's also the frustrating aspect of combining what seem to be conflicting attributes and squeezing them together under a hydraulic press. God is omnipotent, you say? What even is omnipotent? Can God bring about logical impossibilities? Suddenly the omni-traits wind up having variety to them. Is God all-powerful or just maximally powerful? Is he just powerful enough to be called God? What does that even mean? He's omnibenevolent and omnipotent at the same time? Well, can God lie? Is that within his nature? Wait, is omnipotence only the abilities to do what is within your nature? My beard fits that description. Is it omnipotent? The answer to that, of course, is yes. My beard is, in fact, omnipotent. It doesn't matter what definition you use. While polytheism doesn't avoid this criticism entirely, traditional polytheism does make things easier by not holding to the triomny attributes as an aspect of deity. The contradictions that arise by holding to those are just completely avoided for a more easily coherent set of descriptions. Now, I'm not going to try and say that polytheism has an exact consistency among the wide and various traditions of polytheism, because that's just not the case. There's absolutely a variety of conceptions of deity among polytheists. But wouldn't that be what one would expect among a variety of gods? Imagine trying to describe a tree to someone and then expressing to them that trees have broad leaves, but then someone else pipes up and goes, "Hey, trees actually have leaves that look like needles." Now, suddenly trees have conflicting descriptions, and therefore, they must not exist. Everybody knows that guy that brings up conflicts in the ontology of monotreism. But that can be explained by there being different kinds of trees, can't it? There is diversity among trees, just as there are among stars, planets, and seemingly everything else in the universe. Why not the gods? Just as the polytheist holds that there is a multiplicity of the divine, they can also hold that there is a multiplicity of types of the divine. And I made a video discussing the variety among gods and godlike entities present only in heathenry, many of which contain attributes that would be considered in conflict if present in a single being. But in polytheism, those conflicts manifest merely as distinctions between many. And there are attributes that they seem to share, which helps build a coherent definition of deity, and that is also discussed further in that video. But this is a case in which Occam's razor sides strongly with polytheism, in my opinion. Which is the simpler explanation for the diversity of descriptions? One impossibly conceivable entity that has a myriad of objections on the grounds of its coherency? Or many diverse deities? And I would argue that many diverse deities is a far simpler explanation and should be preferred not only because it's simpler, but because the simpler explanation also remedies problems with coherency. This ties in with the final objection, which is the appeal to diversity. Essentially, this is the atheist iteration of the theist's appeal to experience. It attempts to use the appeal to experience against the theist by noting the diversity of experiences, and that this diversity comes into conflict. And not only are there a diversity of experiences, but a diversity of traditions. And these various traditions conflict with one another and cannot all be true. For example, among traditions, there are conflicts between the creation narrative. One god, two gods, more involved in creation. What's true? Now, the tree analogy that I made earlier applies to many of the objections that one might make with this appeal, but obviously not to cases in which there is a single fact of the matter, such as the number of gods that created the cosmos, assuming divine origin. Well, I guess 0 is also a number, so we don't even need to assume divine origin for there to be an answer to that question. But whatever the case, let's talk about how this conflict manifests among polytheists. I wrote down the answer to that because the answer is fairly complex. So let's see what I've got here. It doesn't. Oh, so let's explain that a bit. All right. So generally, polytheists are aware that there is a diversity among their traditions. And one of the aspects of this diversity is conflict among the descriptions of what we might call a mythic fact, such as the number of deities, if any, that created the universe. Polytheists also understand that the answer to this question is unknowable, at least with our current abilities. We can find out more and more information about the origin of the universe, but as of yet, we do not know how that relates to deity or whether or not deity was even involved, and it's entirely possible that we will never have that information. So arguing about it is, it's largely pointless. We can put forward justifications for a position regarding one or many, like I discussed in my video on theistic arguments, such as the cosmological argument and the various perspectives on that. But this diversity doesn't seem to matter when it comes to what is important to polytheists. And one could also easily build a theodicy out of this, saying that the diversity of unknowables within various traditions gives us the opportunity for the good of pluralism in light of that diversity manifesting in what are ultimately unresolvable distinctions. So Richard Swinburne, who I mentioned earlier, also responds to this criticism in a way that I think that polytheists can easily copy for our own benefit. He states in the same video that some variety is to be expected, and it gives us the opportunity to intellectually examine our traditions and come to the best conclusions. Now, for polytheists, this can be said of traditions that manifest with harmful beliefs or practices. We can provide ethical arguments to make a better tradition and have grounding to combat harmful beliefs. Now, this position, coming in part from a monotheist, can easily be adapted into a pluralistic view of polytheist traditions. We can and should have tolerance with respect to a diversity of unknowables, but in addition, we can and should make arguments that improve those traditions, especially in the cases of harmful practices. But beyond that, what is the most straightforward explanation to the diversity of experience? It's polytheism. I can understand someone trying to use the diversity of experience against monotheism, but not against a polytheist. Imagine objecting to polytheism with the multiplicity of experiences. It would just be describing polytheism. Let me know where y'all are at on this. The arguments for atheism are certainly interesting, and there's many more than what I expressed here. It's definitely a broader tradition of argumentation than just stating that one is convinced or not convinced. There's reasons behind the objections and substantive discussion about the validity of theism and the challenges that it presents. But it does seem often that the strength of the arguments relies heavily on the attributes commonly linked uniquely to monotheist traditions. Now, this isn't to say that none of them have any strength against polytheism. It's clear that some of them do. And to be clear, I think that one can rationally and reasonably hold to atheism. But I'd say that polytheism can be utilized to sufficiently address atheistic arguments such that it's not as affected by them as monotheism clearly is. But here's the thing that I find interesting. Monotheism is still seen philosophically as competitive with atheism. There are substantive disagreements over which is more likely, atheism or monotheism, especially using the strategy of comparing the weight of all arguments together against each other. Now, Richard Swinburne makes the point about theistic arguments that it doesn't really seem that any one in particular lands a victory for theism, but that when one looks at all of the theistic arguments together, they make a convincing cumulative case. And I can agree with this point, but I think that it works far better with the cumulative case for polytheism. For me, it seems that given that the arguments for theism largely work just as well and sometimes better for polytheism, and that the arguments for atheism are either rendered inert or do not affect polytheism as well as monotheism, and that monotheism is seen as comparative to atheism in likelihood, well, we would therefore conclude that polytheism is far more likely than either one. Now, this is half snark, but only half. I think it's something that needs to be considered. I genuinely hold that the cumulative argument, especially considering experience, works most strongly for polytheism. And this is one of the reasons that I remain a polytheist. But with that, hail to my patrons for making this content possible. It's good to have people at your back. This one required a ton of preparation, so a big shout out to my supportive patrons who keep this channel going. The like button and subscribe button have gotten into an argument and they're being quite loud, so you should hit both of them. And ring the bell if you want to be kept posted for more heathen content. And remember to find a way or make one. Interesting video, Ocean, but the whole thing is a straw man. Atheism is actually just the lack of belief and makes no claims. In this 4,000 word video comment, I will